imagine you're walking into this totally sterile, modern corporate office, right?
Okay, yeah. I can picture it.
And a junior employee just stands up, walks right over to his boss's desk, and aggressively confronts him for using Jesus' name as a curse word.
Oh, wow. Just right there in the open.
Right there. I mean, he isn't making some polite HR complaint. He is, like, demanding reverence.
Yeah.
And he's fully prepared to be fired on the spot, driven by this unshakable belief that he is engaged in, like, active supernatural warfare.
Right. And that kind of deliberate, almost confrontational friction, that's exactly the operating frequency of the document we are analyzing today.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we are unpacking a text that basically wants to take the comfortable, welcoming country club atmosphere of modern Christianity, tear it down to the absolute studs, and replace it with what is essentially a Special Forces selection course.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
It's titled Regiment of Christ 2026, a Manifesto for the Last Hour Harvest, and it's authored by Joseph Bay.
It is an intense read, to say the least.
It really is.
Bay is constructing this really detailed blueprint for a radical rejection of what he calls soft Christianity.
Soft Christianity, yeah.
And the foundational unit of this whole architecture, it isn't, a massive mega church congregation. It's a microscopic, heavily guarded structure. He calls it the regiment.
The regiment. And it's a regiment of exactly 20 men, which, I mean, not hundreds. Just 20.
Yeah, a very strict limit.
And my first thought when reading this was just about the psychology of that specific number.
Sure.
Because, in a group of thousands, you can hide.
Oh, for sure. You can just blend into the back row.
Exactly. You can be a spectator.
Yeah.
But in a group of 20, your flaws, your discipline, your daily habits, they are completely exposed to everyone else in the room.
Which is precisely the mechanism he is trying to trigger here. Day is drawing really heavily on the historical model of the British Army.
Okay, the British Army model.
Yeah, because in that military framework, you don't fight for some abstract concept. You fight for the man right beside you.
That makes sense.
Right. Loyalty to a small historic band of brothers turns abstract belief into concrete warfare. But to make that work, the barrier to entry has to be extraordinarily high.
Extraordinarily high is almost an understatement. I mean, he literally uses the phrase, no novices, right?
Yes, he does.
Pulling directly from the Apostle Paul's letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy 3.6. And the reasoning really fascinated me.
Oh, yeah, it's an interesting psychological take.
It's not just about weeding out people who aren't committed, He warns that a recent convert placed into this intense elite environment will naturally develop an untested ego.
Right, because they suddenly feel like they're part of this elite vanguard.
Exactly. And that ego will curdle into pride.
Yeah.
And that pride will act like a bomb, just destroying the regiment from the inside out.
The psychological insight there is really sharp, honestly. Unearned elitism is toxic to a unit like this.
So who exactly does he want?
Well, according to the manifesto, he wants men who have survived life's absolute worst battles.
Like what kind of battles?
He specifically lists men who fought addiction and won, men who held their marriages together when, the surrounding culture gave them every excuse to walk away.
Wow. Okay, but surviving personal trauma doesn't automatically turn 20 guys into a cohesive military unit.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
There has to be some kind of bonding mechanism. And Bay insists they must go through a shared crucible of just extreme physical, mental, and spiritual hardship.
Yes.
He points specifically to something called the Extreme Character Challenge, or XCC.
Right. Because shared suffering strips away all pretense. I mean, a casual Sunday morning coffee fellowship, that cannot forge the bonds required for what Bay is planning.
Right.
The hardship isn't just an accidental byproduct of the group. The hardship is the filter.
It's a filter.
Exactly. It's what creates this unyielding masculine glory he describes, rooting these men in a historical cloud of witnesses.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate on the structural logic here for a second.
Sure.
If the requirements are this ironclad, doesn't that inherently exclude, like, the vast majority of everyday believers? I mean, it sounds less like a church and more like an elite vanguard.
Well, Bay would argue that is a feature, not a bug.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He isn't aiming for inclusivity. He's aiming for lethality.
Lethality.
He believes the broader culture is in a state of terminal decline. So, in his view, you don't turn the tide of war with millions of uncommitted civilians.
You just can't organize them.
Exactly. You turn it with a tiny, fiercely dedicated vanguard.
Okay, so if you have these 20 hardened men who have survived this intense crucible, you have to feed them because you can't run a high-performance engine on cheap fuel.
No, you definitely cannot.
Which brings us to Bay's daily requirements for their intellectual and spiritual diet.
Yeah.
And rigorous feels like an inadequate word here.
Very inadequate.
Yeah.
Total saturation is his baseline.
Right.
Bay requires every single book of the Bible to be read cover to cover at least 10 times.
10 times every book.
Yes, and he emphasizes really rigorous study, not just passive skimming.
And to pull that off, they follow the machine reading plan. For you
Oh.
listening, that's this super intensive system where you read through the entire Old Testament once a year
Yeah.
and the New Testament and Psalms twice a year.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift.
And then you add to that heavy memorization of strategically chosen Psalms, like 27, 34, 101, and the entire Sermon on the Mount.
Which is chapters long, yeah.
But the method of delivery is what really caught my attention here, is his philosophy on technology.
The technology angle is arguably the most modern, proactive element of the entire manifesto.
Right, because he demands that these men be builders, not spectators.
Exactly.
And I found myself thinking of them as building these digital clean rooms because they aren't going the Amish route.
No, they're very plugged in.
Right, they aren't throwing their smartphones into a river and rejecting modernity. Instead, he specifically mandates using clean, distraction-free, native iOS apps to deliver this machine plan with New King James Version text.
Yeah.
He literally says they must build technology that feeds the saints instead of serving Babylon.
I think the digital clean room metaphor is perfectly applied there. I mean,
Yeah.
Bay explicitly states, feast on the word, starve the flesh.
Starve the flesh.
Right. He recognizes that modern technology is primarily engineered to distract, soften, and basically commodify human attention.
Yeah, the algorithms.
Exactly. If
Yeah.
you just use the internet as it currently exists, you are ingesting Babylon.
So by taking control of the code, by building these native apps with like zero algorithmic clutter, they are weaponizing modern tech to enforce ancient monastic disciplines.
They really are. It is a form of strict environmental control. Because if the regiment is going to survive the psychological warfare of the modern world, their digital inputs must be ruthlessly curated.
All right, so let's look at the operating system they are installing in these digital clean rooms.
Okay.
Armed with this massive biblical diet, what kind of theology actually powers these men when they step out their front door?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because the Manifesto introduces a theological hybrid that seems almost paradoxical.
It is a highly unusual fusion. Basically, Bay merges what he calls solid Reformed roots with latter rain's Pentecostal power.
Okay, wait. For the listener who isn't steeped in deep church history, mixing rigid Reformed doctrine with chaotic Pentecostal supernaturalism is, well, it's like trying to wire a high-voltage electrical current through a very rigid titanium skeleton.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Historically, these two camps do not get along. I mean, one is highly intellectual and structural, and the other is highly emotional and spontaneous.
Right.
How does Bay justify welding them together?
He justifies it by assigning each tradition a very specific utilitarian function in his warfare model.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the titanium skeleton you mentioned, the Reformed roots, that serves as their defensive armor. Bay argues that you need inflexible, rigid theology to protect the regiment's mind against modern cultural shifts. He specifically lists things like feminism, humanism, and the sexual revolution as forces that will just crush a soft theology. So the Reformed skeleton guards the objective truth.
I see. And the Pentecostal side is the high-voltage electricity.
Exactly. It's the offensive capability.
Defensive capability.
Right. He points to massive historical spiritual outpourings. Things like the Azusa Street Revival, the Welsh Revival, and Pyongyang in 1907.
Real historical events.
Yes. In Bay's framework, the Holy Spirit is not some abstract metaphor. The Spirit is literally power for the harvest.
Wow.
He expects these men to practically operate in tongues, signs, wonders, healing, and prophecy.
So he basically says refusing to let these supernatural gifts loose while the world burns is just like a dereliction of duty.
That's exactly his point, because the rigid skeleton keeps them grounded, but the electricity gives them the offensive power to, as he puts it, cast out demons and actively attack the darkness.
Which kind of brings us back to that visceral image we started the deep dive with.
The office confrontation.
Yeah. This theology doesn't stay in a church pew. He calls for this battle-tested courage in really mundane spaces, like the corporate workplace.
Oh, yeah, he wants it everywhere.
Confronting colleagues, leading early morning corporate prayers at a Korean business dinner, or even just at a Western office desk.
Emulating David's mighty men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He completely rejects what he calls the castrated, feelings-first religion of the modern church.
Because the modern church, in his view, is just paralyzed by the fear of being impolite.
Impolite. Yeah.
The regiment is designed to break those taboos. They are fueled by an uncompromising truth and powered by a supernatural mandate.
So you have this hardened unit of men. They have a titanium skeleton of theology and a high-voltage offensive capability. They are armed with digital clean rooms.
Right.
What exactly are they aiming this weapon at?
The enemy.
Yes, which brings us to Bay's definition of the enemy. And I'll remind you, listening, once again, we are just breaking down the mechanics of the text impartially.
Yeah, the distinction Bay makes here is vital for understanding his entire worldview. For him, the ultimate enemy is not a political party.
That's not.
No. He views leftism as a literal satanic nature.
See, treating an ideology as a satanic nature fundamentally changes the rules of engagement.
Oh, completely.
You can debate a political opponent. You cannot reason with an invasive demonic virus. You have to eradicate it to save the host.
And Bay explains the mechanics of why he views it this way. According to the text, the core sin of leftism is its diagnostic failure.
Diagnostic failure, what does that mean?
Well, it diagnoses the world's primary problem as inequality rather than sin.
Okay, wow. That is a massive philosophical fork in the road.
He really is.
Because if the root problem of humanity is sin, the solution is personal repentance and salvation. But if you convince people the root problem is inequality, what happens?
You prescribe a utopian revolution.
Right.
You dismantle the family, religion, private property, and the created order to just force an artificial equality.
That makes sense within his framework.
Bay maps this directly onto the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
He argues that this revolutionary worldview inherently violates the Eighth Commandment, which protects private property, and the 10th Commandment, which forbids covetousness.
Because you literally can't redistribute wealth without coveting what someone else has and then taking it.
In his logic, yes, absolutely. And this is why he insists that a polite, anti-communism stance is woefully inadequate.
Right, he introduces that Korean term, right?
Yes,
Gilgong. It demands the total destruction, root and branch of the communist worldview.
It's essentially a scorched earth policy against an ideology. And he believes the other side is using a very predictable playbook to fight back. He outlines what he calls the tyrant's handbook.
Yeah, the handbook, according to Bay, always involves two main tactics: disarming and starving.
Okay.
He specifically defends the Second Amendment as a porcupine defense against tyranny. But the starvation tactic is where his definition broadens significantly.
Yeah, he doesn't just mean literal breadlines when he says starving.
No.
The text lists poison diets, seed oils, chained Bibles, and captured media, all as part of this starvation strategy.
That's all connected for him.
He views physical degradation, like unhealthy diets, and spiritual degradation as the exact same poison, delivered by the exact same enemy. Leftism and what he calls its soft Christian cousins are lumped together as agents of this degradation.
Right.
The regiment's duty is to scorn it, refuse to be disarmed physically or spiritually, and just raise their own banner.
But this level of intense, all-encompassing warfare, it implies a clock is ticking.
Yes.
I mean, you don't live at this level of heightened alert indefinitely
Yeah.
unless you believe a deadline is approaching.
Exactly.
Which introduces the Manifesto's foundational sense of urgency. It's eschatology.
Right, and eschatology is just the theology of how the world ends. Bay states that a premillennial eschatology is non-negotiable for the regiment.
Okay, let's translate that for the listener really quick. Premillennialism is the belief that the world is basically going to get progressively worse, human institutions will fail, and Jesus must physically return to Earth before a literal 1,000-year reign of peace can begin, where he'll rule with a rod of iron.
Perfect summary. And he absolutely rejects the theological alternatives to this. So, amillennialism and postmillennialism.
Why does he reject them?
Because Bay argues that if you believe the church is going to slowly conquer the world through positive influence and bring about a golden age before Christ returns, you lose your urgency.
Exactly.
You start getting comfortable.
Yeah, he uses a really fascinating phrase here. He says those other views risk the fatal error of immanentizing the eschaton.
Yeah, it's a dense academic phrase.
It is. But functionally, it means trying to force heaven on earth through human effort alone. He claims that trying to build a human utopia right now is functionally identical to the Marxist project.
Because human effort cannot fix a fundamentally broken world. Bay paints a really stark, bleak picture of reality here.
He really does.
He writes, England's reckoning is coming. The wolf is already in Downing Street. He just sees the darkness accelerating.
But wait, let me trace a psychological thread here.
Okay.
If human effort can't fix the world, right? And society is destined to just get darker and darker until a divine rescue happens, doesn't that usually breed passivity?
You would think so.
I mean, why bother fighting if the ship is mathematically guaranteed to sink? Why does Bay argue this view actually creates urgency?
Because the nature of the mission shifts entirely. You are no longer trying to patch the hull of the Titanic. You know the ship is going down.
Right.
So the mission is purely a rescue operation. You are furiously pulling people out of the freezing water and onto the lifeboats.
Oh, wow.
When you realize you can't save the system, the harvest of individual souls becomes hyper-urgent.
Ah. The ticking clock isn't counting down to society's salvation, it's counting down to society's collapse.
Precisely. And Bay breaks this urgent mission down into 3 distinct realms the regiment must hold in tension at all times.
What are they?
First, the church realm, which is focused intensely on evangelism and discipleship. Second, the civic realm, where they actively, loudly resist leftism and cultural rot.
And the third?
And third, the eternal realm, maintaining this eager, almost aching expectation for the millennial kingdom. They preach, they fight the civic battles, but they do it knowing that ultimate lasting victory is completely out of human hands.
Okay, so we've built the complete picture of this soldier. 20 hardened men, soaked in scripture via clean tech, wielding a titanium reform theology with Pentecostal offensive power, fighting a spiritual war against a satanic political virus, furiously pulling people onto lifeboats before the clock hits 0.
That's the blueprint.
But what is the ultimate weapon that powers all of this? How do they sustain that intense state of being?
Well, the Manifesto reserves this for the climax. The crown of all their practices, what Bay literally calls the church's thermonuclear weapon, is the combination of extreme fasting and prayer.
And to be clear, this is not like skipping lunch on a Tuesday.
No, not at all.
He is mandating fasting for 21 days or more, which, from a purely physiological standpoint, going 21 days without food fundamentally alters your brain chemistry.
Oh, totally. And Bay is fully aware of the physical toll. He writes that during this extended fast, the body burns away fat and the spirit sharpens into a blade.
A blade.
Yes. The regiment obeys this because Jesus assumed his followers would fast. It is designed to shatter pride, force humility, and trigger supernatural breakthrough.
But it's not a silent, meditative fast, is it?
No.
The prayer that accompanies this massive physical depletion is explosive. He mandates loud, raw, simultaneous corporate prayer.
Yeah, he points to the Korean tradition of Tongzonggido.
Right.
That's where the entire group is crying out at the top of their lungs at the exact same time.
Imagine the psychological state of 20 men, physically empty from a 21-day fast, crying out simultaneously in just raw affliction and faith.
It is designed to completely shift the atmosphere of a room. I mean, it is disciplined, heavily physical, entirely supernatural, and just radically countercultural to the modern quiet church experience.
So synthesizing everything Bay has laid out for you all listening, he is painting a vision of meat-eating, weightlifting, fasting warriors.
Yeah.
Men who run their own households with intense strictness. I mean, the text explicitly mentions wives submitting and children being raised with the rod and the word.
Because the household is the proving ground.
It's the first regiment.
Exactly. These are the men he believes are required to supercharge the final harvest as the world spirals into its last hour.
It is a document that leaves absolutely no room for the casual observer.
Yeah.
It demands total sacrifice and views the modern obsession with comfort as a fatal disease.
It really does.
It's an intense architectural blueprint for an uncompromising worldview. And honestly, it leaves us with something incredibly profound to chew on as we wrap up today.
Yeah, the big question.
Regardless of your own personal beliefs, or how you view the politics of this manifesto, it highlights a fascinating human phenomenon.
It really does.
In an age where we have endless distraction, total convenience, and just maximum comfort. Why is there such a growing, intense hunger among young men to seek out systems that demand absolute sacrifice, extreme physical hardship, and unapologetic rigidity?
It's powerful. Because when comfort becomes the baseline, hardship becomes the only way to feel alive.
It's a question worth exploring, something for you to think about.
Absolutely.
We'll leave you with that.